In Chapter 2, we're going to be talking about the U.S. Constitution, what's really a remarkable document. It's quite short, broad principles, but it's really stood the test of time. It's remained largely intact since it was passed. And we'll take a look at the context of how it was developed by the framers. Let's start with a little colonial background. 1607, English government sent a group of people to Jamestown and gave those folks full power and authority to make laws. The colonists there set up a representative assembly where basically a legislature made up of individuals representing the population. People who came over on the Mayflower, people who were dissatisfied with the Church of England, looking for a place to practice their own religious beliefs. They formed the Mayflower Compact, which wasn't really a constitution, but a statement setting forth the idea of the consent of affected individuals. And the Pilgrims, their beliefs really were different from what we think about when the Constitution was written. Pilgrims had formed a religious colony, no attempt to separate church and state. Over the years, by 1732, there were 13 colonies established, and through legislation in those colonies, the colonists were able to gain political experience that they would use in years to come. Let's talk a little bit about things that happened next. That what we found, the British Parliament began to pass laws that treated colonies as a unit, and they were really taxing the colonies to pay for the military debt from the French and Indian War. You see, 1764, the Sugar Act, Parliament passed it, colonists protested. 1765, the Stamp Act, more taxes, colonist taxation without representation, they called it. And that led to the Boston Tea Party that most of you are familiar with. And finally, in 1774, British Parliament passed a coercive act, and they closed Boston Harbor, and Massachusetts government placed under British rule, and that's when the colonists had really had enough. So in response, the colonists set up the First Continental Congress. And this gathering wasn't to claim independence, but it was really to petition the King of England with a list of grievances. And they also resolved to raise troops in each colony and boycott British trade. Second Continental Congress, by the time the Second Continental Congress came around, fighting had already begun between the British and the colonists. The main focus of this Congress, established an army, declared George Washington commander-in-chief. And Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, really reflected the public opinion in plain language. For instance, the pamphlet talked about government being our own national right, natural right. So in 1776, Second Continental Congress voted for trade policies that implied independence. And following that, in fairly short order, in June 1776, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Resolution of Independence. July 4th, of course, 1776, Declaration of Independence was accepted. And a couple of important concepts in the Declaration of Independence that really clearly illustrate why it's one of the world's most significant documents. First, universal truth. Universal truth. The Declaration of Independence held that all men were created equal, and natural rights and unalienable rights, including the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this reflected the thoughts of English philosopher John Locke, who argued for a social contract. That's a voluntary agreement among individuals to secure their rights and welfare by creating a government and abiding by its rules. And quickly, the significance of the Declaration of Independence really didn't, as Abraham Lincoln noted several years later, had no practical value in separating the U.S. from Britain, but still it set up ideals that are part of the national identity and established the legitimacy of a new nation to foreign nations. And during the Revolutionary War, states had to create a self-government for the United States. And they really couldn't agree on the role of a central government for the newly independent nation. So, and two of the states, Georgia and Pennsylvania, adopted unicameral legislatures. So, in this case, the legislature was the dominant body. There wasn't a strong central government, but there were powerful legislatures in each state. So in June of '76, the fear of a too powerful government led the Second Continental Congress to begin drafting the Articles of Confederation, really the first form of our government. Some of the highlights: the Articles of Confederation allowed one vote for each state, appointed an executive committee to carry out laws, and regulated foreign affairs. And here are some of the powers of the Congress of the Confederation. The Articles themselves, some of their accomplishments, that certain states were able to gave up their land claims in the West, and for the first time, resources were pooled by American states. But even with the successes, there were weaknesses in these articles. That Congress couldn't demand revenue from states, could only ask. They needed 9 of 13 states to approve actions, and needed unanimous consent to amend the articles. There was no central authority, no national system of courts, and no power to raise funds for a militia. And finally, Shays' Rebellion was an uprising by a band of farmers that convinced political leaders that the central government under the Articles was incapable of maintaining order or providing for the public welfare. The solution in this case appeared to be a stronger central government. So then we move on to drafting our Constitution. That the September 1786 meeting of all states was called to address the multiple weaknesses that needed to be corrected, and petitioned the Continental Congress for a convention to address the needs of the national government. The delegates, there was a split in the delegates about what type of government, how strong the government should be, its structure, strength. Majority wanted a strong central government, but disagreed on the details. But there were some delegates who opposed a strong national government. At the start of the convention, Edmund Randolph from the Virginia delegation was ready to present 15 resolutions proposing fundamental changes in the nation's government. That really set the tone for the discussion through the remainder of the convention. I moved quickly through some of the plans. The Virginia plan, based on a bicameral legislature, power concentrated in a lower chamber chosen by the people. The legislature would elect an unspecified national executive and appoint a national judiciary. The representation was by population, so that would be a disadvantage to the small states. The New Jersey plan maintained one state, one vote structure that was already in place. And the New Jersey plan, one of its major features was the supremacy doctrine. That gives the priority of national law over state laws. The supremacy doctrine gives priority of national law over state laws, and that's a doctrine that was later included in the Constitution. Roger Sherman of Connecticut then proposed a compromise between the more populous states, which wanted representation based on population, and the small states, which wanted representation equal for each state. The Great Compromise proposed a bicameral legislature, one chamber based on population, the House of Representatives, and the other based on equal representation for each state. That would be the Senate. That's what we see today. And finally, the 3/5 Compromise, that related to serious doubts about slavery. Delegates from the South wanted slaves to be counted in determining representation in Congress. Delegates from the North objected. The 3/5 Compromise provided that 3/5 of the slaves would be counted. That's the 3/5 Compromise. And some other issues that were resolved at the convention: U.S. government wouldn't tax exports, and Congress could regulate trade between the states with foreign nations. And finally, it created a Supreme Court. So now the framers worked toward a final agreement. And that agreement, based on the Madisonian model, a separation of powers, that no one branch of government could dominate the others. Madisonian model includes checks and balances. That means each of the major powers, the executive branch, legislative, and judicial branches, can check and confront the other two. And the Madisonian model also included the Electoral College. That's where the president's not chosen by Congress, but not by a direct popular vote either. And that's a system that we continue to have today. Here's a chart about some of the checks and balances. That you can see that Supreme Court can declare presidential actions unconstitutional. President can veto laws passed by Congress. Congress can override a veto. Congress can impeach and remove a president. So there's not one branch of the government that's more powerful than another. And the final document, and the principles established in the Constitution included popular sovereignty, a republican form of government, limited government with written laws, separation of powers with checks and balances to prevent any one branch from gaining too much power, and a federal system that allows for states to have some powers.